The silence was the first thing that broke my heart. A creek has a voice, a steady, rhythmic pulse that lets a man know the world is still turning. But that Tuesday morning, the rocks were bone dry, and the moss was already curling into black soot. I stood on the bank, my boots sinking into the damp mud that was quickly becoming a grave. Upstream, a massive concrete gate had dropped like a guillotine, diverted by a corporation that claimed the sky, the earth, and every drop of sweat in between. They didn't see a farm, they saw a commodity. They didn't see a man, they saw an obstacle. If you believe the land has a soul that no bank can ever truly own, hit the subscribe button and join us here at Beyond the Fields. I looked at that empty streambed and felt a cold fire ignite. They had the money, but I had the roots. To understand the weight of that dry creek, you have to understand the dirt beneath my fingernails. It isn't just soil. It's the evaporated sweat of 7 generations of men and women who looked at these jagged hills and saw a future. My great-great-grandfather, Silas, arrived here when the world was nothing but wind and tall grass. He didn't have a tractor or a bank loan. He had a team of oxen, a rusted plow, and a stubbornness that bordered on a sickness. He spent 3 years pulling stones out of the north pasture, one by one, stacking them into walls that still stand today. Those walls aren't just boundaries. They are the physical manifestation of a man's refusal to be broken by the wild. Every stone represents a blister, a prayer, and a promise that this ground would provide for those who came after him. I grew up hearing the stories of the Great Drought of 1934, when the sky turned into a furnace and the topsoil took flight, darkening the sun for days on end. My grandfather told me how they stayed. They didn't run for the cities like so many others. They dug deeper wells until their hands were raw. They hauled buckets of water from the valley floor on their backs just to keep a single row of corn alive. They knew that if you leave the land when it's hurting, you lose your right to call it home when it's flourishing. That history is etched into the very grain of the barn doors. It's in the way the floorboards creak under my feet, echoing the footsteps of men who walked this house before the light bulb was even a dream. When I walk through the orchard, I see trees that were planted by my father to celebrate my birth. I see the grafting scars where he joined a hardy rootstock to a sweet fruit, a metaphor for how we've survived here. We aren't just residents. We are part of the biology. My blood carries the same minerals as the spring water, or at least it used to. The connection is a cord that stretches back through decades of winter blizzards and summer heat waves. We've seen the market crash, we've seen the wars take the young men away, and we've seen the blight try to wither the harvest. But the land remained. It was the only constant in a shifting world. My father used to say that a man is only as tall as the dirt he stands on. If he sells his dirt, he becomes a ghost. That's why the silence of the creek felt like a knife in the ribs. It wasn't just about irrigation. It was about the theft of a legacy. The water that ran through that creek was the lifeblood of 7 generations. It was the water Silas used to wash the dust of the trail from his face. It was the water my mother used to boil the jars for the summer canning. To see it stopped up by a corporate valve, controlled by a computer 500 miles away, felt like an insult to every grave in the family plot. I spent that first night walking the perimeter of the property, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I looked at the withered leaves of the pumpkins and the drooping heads of the sunflowers. I could almost hear the ancestors whispering in the wind, asking me what I was going to do. They didn't endure the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression just so their descendant could sit quietly while a group of men in silk ties choked the life out of the valley. The dust on my boots was older than the corporation's entire portfolio. It was a dust made of bone and leaf and stone. It was a dust that knew how to wait. It was a dust that knew how to endure. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my own survival. I was the guardian of a long, unbroken chain. I was the voice for the silent stones and the dry roots. The corporation thought they were buying water rights from a neighboring estate, but they didn't realize they were trying to buy the soul of a lineage that had survived long before they existed and intended to remain long after they were gone. I felt the grit of the earth between my palms and made a silent vow. This land had seen empires rise and fall, and it would see this corporation crumble too, if I had to spend every last breath I had to make it happen. You don't just walk away from 7 generations of dust. You dig in. You hold fast. You wait for the moment to strike back, because the land doesn't forget who truly belongs to it. The confrontation happened 3 days later in a makeshift office trailer parked near the new diversion dam. I didn't go there looking for a fight. I went there looking for a neighborly conversation, though I should have known better. The man behind the desk was named Miller. He wore a suit that cost more than my first tractor and had hands that had never felt the bite of a winter morning. He didn't look up when I walked in, let alone offer me a seat. To him, I was just a part of the scenery, a rustic inconvenience that came with the zip code. When I told him the creek was dry and my livestock were suffering, he gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He pulled out a tablet and swiped through a series of colorful maps and digital contracts. He spoke in a silver-tongued dialect of resource optimization, downstream yields, and legally binding acquisitions. He told me, with an air of practiced boredom, that the water rights had been purchased in a private sale from the old Miller estate upstream. No relation to him, just a coincidence of name. He explained that according to the modern state water board filings, those rights were absolute and senior to any informal use I might have enjoyed over the years. I tried to explain that those rights had been shared for a century, that there was a natural flow requirement that had been honored since the town was founded. He laughed then. It wasn't a mean laugh, which made it worse. It was a condescending chuckle, the kind a teacher gives a child who doesn't understand how the world works. He told me that my understanding of the law was a relic of the past, a quaint folk tale that had no place in the era of corporate infrastructure. He called my claims outdated sentimentality. He said the world had moved on from the days of handshakes and gentlemen's agreements. In his eyes, the water wasn't a gift of nature. It was an asset to be liquidated for the highest possible return. He told me I was welcome to file a grievance with the state, knowing full well that their legal team would bury a lone farmer in paperwork for a decade before a single hearing was ever scheduled. He looked me up and down, lingering on the grease under my nails and the patch on my work shirt, and told me that maybe it was time for me to evolve. He suggested I sell the farm to his company for a fair market value before the lack of water turned my property into a wasteland. It was a threat wrapped in a suggestion. He was betting on my desperation. He was betting that a man with a mortgage and a dying crop would fold when faced with the cold, hard reality of a billion-dollar balance sheet. He spoke about the greater good of their industrial project, as if their profits were somehow more holy than the food I grew to feed the local families. The arrogance was thick enough to choke on. He didn't just want the water. He wanted the submission. He wanted me to acknowledge that his world, the world of ink and digital signatures, was superior to the world of soil and season. I stood there, feeling the heat rise in my neck, but I didn't shout. I didn't lose my temper. My father always said that when a man starts bragging about his power, it's usually because he's afraid you'll find where he's weak. I looked at the maps on his screen. They were clean, precise, and completely devoid of the reality of the terrain. They didn't show the hidden springs, the ancient drainage pipes, or the way the land sloped after a heavy rain. They were abstractions. Miller was a man who lived in abstractions. He thought that because he had the most expensive lawyers, he had the truth. He dismissed me as a simple man with a simple mind, incapable of navigating the complexities of modern law. He told me the living water belonged to those who could afford to harness it. I left that trailer without saying another word, the sound of his dismissive clicking on the keyboard following me out into the dusty heat. He thought he had ended the conversation. He thought he had put the old dog in his place. But as I walked back to my truck, I realized his arrogance was his greatest blind spot. He didn't think I was worth the effort of a thorough investigation. He assumed that because I was poor by his standards, I was also ignorant. He didn't realize that a man who spends his life observing the patterns of the earth becomes a master of detail. He didn't realize that in this valley, the ground hides more than just roots. It hides history. And history, if you know where to look, has a way of rising up to haunt those who think they can bury it under a mountain of new paper. By the end of the second week, the reality of the situation began to set in with a crushing weight. The green of my cornfields had turned to a sickly, pale yellow, the leaves curling into tight ribbons as if trying to hide from the merciless sun. Every morning I woke up to the sound of the wind rattling through the dying stalks, a dry, ghostly sound that felt like a funeral march. The pond had retreated to a muddy puddle in the center, the cracked earth at its edges looking like a jigsaw puzzle of failure. I had to sell off 20 head of cattle just because I couldn't haul enough water to keep them from thirsting to death. Watching that trailer pull away with my best heifers, knowing I was selling them for pennies on the dollar because the buyers knew I was desperate, was a bitterness I can't rightly describe. The town watched. That was the hardest part. In a small community, your ruin is public property. I'd see the neighbors at the general store, and they'd look away or offer a pitying nod that felt like a shovelful of dirt on my chest. They were scared too. They saw what was happening to me and knew they were next. The corporation was a shadow moving across the valley, and I was the first one to be swallowed by it. My heart felt heavy, like a stone in my ribcage. I sat on my porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over a landscape that was turning gray. There's a specific kind of grief that comes with watching something you love die because of someone else's greed. It's a helpless, suffocating feeling. I started to wonder if Miller was right. Maybe I was an anomaly. Maybe the age of the independent farmer was over, and I was just a stubborn ghost haunting a world that didn't want me anymore. The bank called, their voices polite but thin, asking about my projections for the fall. They didn't care about the dry creek. They cared about the interest. My wife, usually the rock I lean on, started looking at real estate listings in the city, her eyes red from crying when she thought I wasn't looking. The silence in the house was worse than the silence of the creek. It was the silence of a dream being strangled. I felt the legacy of those 7 generations pressing down on me, not as a source of strength, but as a judgment. I felt like the failure, the weak link in the chain that had finally snapped. I took to walking the dry stream bed at night, kicking at the bleached stones. I found a dead trout wedged between two rocks, its eyes clouded over, a small victim of a boardroom decision made in a skyscraper. I picked it up and felt its cold, stiff body. This was what resource optimization looked like. It looked like death. It looked like the end of a way of life. I went into the barn and sat on a hay bale, the smell of dust and old wood surrounding me. I felt the urge to just give up, to sign the papers Miller had offered, and take the money. It would be enough to buy a small house somewhere, a place where I wouldn't have to worry about the rain or the river. But then I looked at the old ledger on the workbench, my grandfather's journal from the 30s. I opened it to a random page. He had written about a winter so cold, the crows froze mid-flight. But he ended the entry with a single line: "The earth is patient, and a man must be more so." I realized then that I was looking at the problem wrong. I was looking at the sky and the dry creek, but I should have been looking at the foundation. The corporation's power was built on paper. Their authority was a construct of words and filings. If I wanted to fight them, I couldn't do it with a shovel or a pump. I had to do it with the one thing they respected: the law. But not their law. I needed the law of the land, the old law, the deep law that existed before they ever bought their first suit. I stood up, the heaviness in my chest shifting into a dull, focused throb of resolve. I wasn't dead yet. The crops might be gone, and the cattle might be sold, but the dirt was still under my feet. And as long as I stood on that dirt, I had a right to fight. I walked back to the house, ignored the bills on the table, and headed for the attic. There was a trunk up there, bound in iron and smelling of cedar and thyme. It held the things we didn't use but couldn't throw away. Somewhere in there was the origin story of this farm, the original grant, the handwritten promises that predated the state itself. If there was a weapon to be found, it was buried in the past. The attic was a tomb of memories, thick with the smell of old paper and the dust of decades. I spent 3 days up there, fueled by black coffee and a desperation that had finally turned into a cold, sharp clarity. I went through old letters, yellowed newspapers, and tax receipts from the 19th century. Most of it was useless. Records of grain prices from 1890, a lock of hair from a child who didn't survive the scarlet fever, maps of fences that had long since rotted away. But then, tucked inside the back cover of a tattered family Bible, I found it. It was a single sheet of vellum, thick and waxy, with ink that had faded to a ghostly brown. It wasn't a deed, not exactly. It was a charter of perpetual usufruct, dated 12 years before the territory had even become a state. It bore the seal of a defunct regional land office and the signature of a man who had been dead for 150 years. I read the words slowly, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The document didn't just describe the land, it described the water. It spoke of the living vein that fed the valley, and it contained a clause that I had never heard of in modern law. It was an elder right, a legal concept from the old world that had been carried over into the early territories. It stated that the water of the creek was inseparable from the soil of the homestead, and that no downstream or upstream diversion could ever diminish the natural flow required for the sustenance of the hearth and the health of the herd. But the real kicker, the ghost in the ledger that made my hands shake, was a specific reservation. It said that the rights to the water were not held by the owner of the land, but were vested in the land itself, and could only be transferred if the soil was utterly abandoned for a period of no less than 20 years. This meant that as long as a single descendant of the original grantee remained on the property, the water rights could not be sold, severed, or diverted by any entity, private or sovereign. The corporation hadn't bought the water rights from the Miller estate because the Miller estate never actually owned them to sell. They were tied to the geographic heart of the valley, my farm. The document was a legal landmine. I took it to an old retired judge in the next county, a man who still preferred books to computers. He spent 4 hours with a magnifying glass, his face growing grimmer and more focused by the minute. When he finally looked up, he had a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He told me that this document was a superior title, a rare artifact of early land law that modern statutes often overlooked, but could never legally supersede without a constitutional challenge. The corporation had done a title search, but they had only gone back 60 years, which was the industry standard. They hadn't gone back to the beginning. They hadn't gone back to the elder right. He told me that by diverting the creek, the corporation wasn't just infringing on my rights, they were committing a trespass against the sovereign soil. The language was archaic, but the power behind it was absolute. I felt a surge of adrenaline that washed away the exhaustion. I had them. These men who thought they were so clever, who thought they could map the world from an office in a city, had missed the one document that made their multi-million-dollar project illegal. They had built their dam on a lie. They had gambled on my ignorance, never imagining that a farmer would have the patience to dig through the ghosts of his ancestors to find the truth. I didn't go back to Miller's trailer with a lawyer. I went back alone. I walked in, laid a photocopy of that vellum on his desk, and waited. He looked at it with that same smug smile, but as he started to read, the color began to drain from his face. He read it once, then twice. He pulled out his phone, likely calling his legal team, his voice cracking as he described the document. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a giant realizing he had stepped into a snare. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a rustic inconvenience. He saw a threat. He saw the 7 generations of dust standing behind me. He tried to offer me money then. Real money. A life-changing amount. He talked about adjusting the settlement. I just looked at him and told him the water wasn't mine to sell. It belonged to the land, and the land was thirsty. I told him he had 24 hours to open the gate, or the next person he'd be talking to would be the state attorney general with a federal injunction for violating a territorial charter. The silver-tongued suit was silent. The ghost in the ledger had spoken, and there was nothing his billions could do to silence it. The climax didn't happen in a courtroom with a gavel. It happened at the edge of the concrete dam, under the high noon sun. Miller was there, along with a crew of engineers and a few nervous-looking men in dark suits who had flown in that morning. They looked like they had been sucked dry of their confidence. The old judge was there too, acting as a witness, his presence lending a weight of ancient authority to the proceedings. There was no shouting, no grand speeches. There was just the cold, hard reality of a legal loophole that was as solid as the mountains. The corporate lawyers had spent the night trying to find a way around the Charter of Perpetual Usufruct, and they had failed. The document was ironclad. To challenge it would mean putting their entire regional operation on hold for years, risking a precedent that could cost them billions in other territories. They were cornered. They had to choose between a humiliating retreat or a catastrophic legal battle they were almost certain to lose. Miller looked at me, his eyes full of a concentrated loathing. He was a man who hated losing, especially to someone he considered beneath him. He signaled to the lead engineer, a man who looked more relieved than anything else. With the turn of a massive wheel and the groan of hydraulic pistons, the gate began to rise. At first, it was just a trickle, a muddy froth that hissed against the dry concrete. But then, as the gap widened, the weight of the reservoir behind it pushed through with a roar. The water came back like a living thing, a silver-gold surge that tumbled down the rocky bed, reclaiming the ground that had been stolen. I stood on the bank and felt the spray on my face, the coolest, sweetest sensation I've ever known. The creek bed, which had been a graveyard of dry stones, was suddenly alive. The water hit the first bend, swirling into the deep pools where the trout used to hide, washing away the dust and the stagnant silt. It was the sound of justice, not the kind you find in books, but the kind that comes from the earth itself. The townspeople had gathered on the bridge further down, and as the water reached them, I heard a cheer go up that echoed through the valley. It wasn't just my farm that was being saved. It was the entire ecosystem, the shared life of the community. The corporation had tried to fence off the sky, but the land had demanded its due. Miller walked over to me, his boots getting splashed by the rising water. He told me that this wasn't over, that they would find a way to modernize the statutes, that they would lobby the legislature until my relic of a document was nothing but a piece of trash. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he was welcome to try. But I reminded him that while he was busy talking to politicians, I'd be busy growing food. I told him that people can't eat digital contracts or drink corporate projections, but they'll always need what comes out of my soil. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow kind of frustration. He and his team packed up their trailers and their tablets and their expensive suits, and they drove away, leaving nothing behind but the concrete scar of a dam that was now a useless monument to their greed. I stayed by the creek long after they were gone. I watched the water clear as the silt settled, the flow becoming steady and rhythmic once again. I felt the tension that had been coiled in my chest for weeks finally begin to unfurl. The law of the living water had held. It wasn't about a clever trick or a lucky find. It was about the fact that some things are too old and too deep to be bought. The corporation had treated the land like a spreadsheet, but the land had remembered its history. As the sun began to set, the creek was singing again, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I walked back to the barn, and for the first time in a month, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a man who had earned his place in the lineage. I had protected the living vein. I had kept the promise Silas made to the wind and the tall grass. The crops were still mostly lost for the season, and the struggle to rebuild the herd would be long and hard, but that didn't matter. The water was back. The life was back. The soil was heavy with the promise of the next year, and for a farmer, that's all the victory you ever need. The arrogance of the powerful had broken against the quiet resilience of the earth, and as I shut the barn doors, I knew the ancestors were finally silent, satisfied that the chain remained unbroken. The water is flowing again, and with it, the soul of this valley has returned. It's a strange thing to realize that a single piece of weathered paper could hold more power than a billion-dollar board of directors. But that's the secret the world forgets. True ownership isn't found in a deed filed in a city office or a stock option traded on a screen. It's found in the calloused hands that tend the earth and the heart that refuses to betray the heritage of the soil. This land has seen plenty of men like Miller come and go, men who think they can master nature with ink and arrogance. But the earth has a way of outlasting them all. It waits for the noise to fade, and then it continues its work, feeding those who respect its laws. As I stand here in the fading light, the smell of damp earth and coming rain filling the air, I feel the weight of the soil, and it's a good weight. It's the weight of responsibility, of legacy, and of a hard-won peace. This is Beyond the Fields, where we remember that the land is the only thing that lasts. Until next time, keep your roots deep and your heart true.